What kind of house can stand against a 100-mile-an-hour gale, keep a family alive at 40 below, and then be gone before sunrise without leaving so much as a scar in the ground? Most people think they already know the answer. They picture a tipi, a simple cone of hides, a romantic prop from the Old West, a tent with a fire in the middle, and nothing more than that. But here is the first thing that image gets wrong, and it is the thing almost nobody expects. Out on the Great Plains, the most reliable killer was not the wind, and it was not the wolves. It was a damp blanket. Hold on to that, because we are coming back to it, and when we do, it will change how you look at every wall you have ever slept behind, because out there, a bad design was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Winter on the plains did not simply punish the unprepared, it erased them. So picture a woman sitting in the long grass with a hide across her knees, pushing a bone needle through it in one deliberate direction. She isn't watching the sky. She isn't reading clouds. And yet, in that moment, she is deciding whether her family survives the next 3 winters. How can a line of stitching know a storm is coming? That is the question this whole film is built around. And it leads to a second one. How did the nations of the Great Plains take poles, hide, cord, and fire, and turn them into one of the most climate-intelligent structures ever built on this continent? Tonight, we are not looking at the tipi as a symbol. We are looking at it as a machine, a survival machine, a structure that turned crosswinds into downforce, smoke into ventilation, animal skin into a breathing weather membrane, and open prairie into a world a family could live in. This is Dark Origins. To understand the tipi, you have to start with the land that forced it into existence. The Great Plains are often called empty, but empty is the wrong word. Empty suggests something passive, something waiting. The plains are none of that. They are active, violent, and mechanical. From Texas up into the Canadian prairies, there are almost no mountains to break the air, almost no forests to slow it, so wind can gather speed across 1,000 miles of grass with nothing in its way, and by the time it arrives, it does not blow. It sweeps. And against that, the human body loses on every front at once. Heat pours out of you by convection as the wind strips it away, by radiation into the open black sky, and by conduction straight down into frozen ground. There is no single point of failure. There are 3, running simultaneously. In that kind of cold, exposed skin becomes a timer. If you have never felt it, it starts small and strange. Your breath freezes into a crust along the collar of your coat. Your fingers stop reporting back before your mind has registered that anything is wrong. And the snow underfoot changes its voice, the soft crunch tightening into a dry squeal, which is how people out there learned that the temperature had crossed a line where mistakes stop being forgiven. Now try to build something permanent in that. Stone and heavy timber sound safer to modern ears, but the plains punish them. The ground freezes solid, thaws and heaves again, working foundations loose season after season. Tall timber is scarce across much of the region. Hauling beams across open country burns human labor and animal strength you cannot spare. And worst of all, a fixed house anchors you to one spot while the bison, the water, and the season all move without you. But here is the part that gets left out of almost every telling. Out on the plains, the thing that killed people was rarely the storm itself. It came afterward. It happened inside the lodge, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and it arrived without a sound. So, the real problem was never simply, how do we build a shelter? The problem was far harder than that. How do you build something that survives one of the harshest climates in North America and still stays light enough to take down, carry, and raise again by nightfall? The answer was never going to come from mass. It came from geometry. Here is the simplest way to understand what geometry does out there. If you build a flat wall on the open plains, the wind sees a handle. A wall gives it something to grab, something broad and vertical to lean its whole weight against. And once it has that handle, it works you from 3 directions at the same time. Pressure piles up against the face. Air spilling over the roofline creates suction that lifts from above. Turbulence churns in the dead space behind. Push in front, lift overhead, tearing at the back, and the structure is pried apart by forces that never agreed to arrive one at a time. The tipi refuses to give the wind that handle. And the reason is a detail most people look straight past, because from a distance, the lodge just reads as a cone. It isn't. It is a tilted cone. Plains lodges were commonly pitched with the back set steep against the prevailing wind, and the front carried longer and shallower, so the storm never met a blunt face. It met a slope. It was invited to split and slide, instead of slamming and stalling. And that slope does something almost unbelievable. The pressure no longer tries to peel the cover upward. It translates into compression running down the length of the poles, pressing their feet harder into the earth. Read that again, because it is the whole secret. The storm does not tear the lodge away. The storm drives it home. That is the first principle hiding inside the shape. Do not fight the dominant force if you can redirect it. A bunker resists wind. A tipi collaborates with it, taking a load that would destroy a rigid building and rooting it into the ground. Underneath that skin, the frame follows the same logic. It begins with 3 poles, because 3 points always define a plane, and on prairie ground that is frozen in one spot, rutted in another, and sloping in a third, 3 legs will always find their footing where 4 might rock. Lash them near the top, raise them, and then lean the rest into that cradle. A dozen poles on a small lodge, 20 or more on a large one. And here the plains teach something our own century has mostly forgotten. We worship stiffness. We treat rigidity as strength. Out there, the opposite was true. Slender lodgepole pine was allowed to bend under a gust instead of snapping, and the rawhide lashings holding the frame were never dead joints. Tied wet, they shrank as they dried into a grip that tightened itself, and yet they kept just enough give to absorb the small movements and pass the stress along. The whole lodge could bow, settle, and recover. But notice what that frame has actually solved. It has answered the wind. It has not touched the thing that comes at 2 in the morning. That storm arrives from the inside, and the poles cannot stop it. The person who solved that one was the woman with the needle. A frame answers force. A cover answers weather, and that is a much harder problem than it sounds. A fresh bison hide is heavy, wet, and biologically unstable. Left alone, it stiffens, rots, and fails. To become architecture, it had to be transformed, scraped clean of flesh and hair, worked and softened by hand, then brain-tanned or cured in smoke depending on the region and the purpose. And the finished skin had to do 4 contradictory things at once. Shed water, resist tearing, stay supple in brutal cold, and still be light enough to roll up and carry when the camp moved. Now count what that costs. A single lodge cover could take a dozen or more prepared hides. Hundreds of hours of labor, weeks of work by women laboring side by side, mothers and daughters and sisters and neighbors, hands cracked from the scraping. A tipi was not really built. It was assembled by a community, stitch by stitch, out of the accumulated skill of everyone who had ever made one before. And now go back to that woman in the grass, and the question we left hanging. Her needle was never wandering. The direction of the cut, the run of the seam, the placement of every reinforced joint was set in relation to the wind that would come, so that the strongest lines of the cover stood where the storm would push hardest. The stitching was the engineering drawing. Without that knowledge, the frame is just wood standing in the wind. Which means we have to say the obvious thing plainly. The work of those women was not decoration around the edges of architecture. It was the architecture. Look up, and the same intelligence is waiting at the top of the lodge. The smoke flaps are not a chimney. They are control surfaces. By angling them against the wind, the people inside could manipulate the pressure over the opening and pull the smoke column upward and out. Wind shifts in the night, you get up and reset them. Rain moves in, you close them down. A fixed hole in a roof is a weakness. An adjustable one is a control system. And that brings us to 2 in the morning, because the killer on the plains was never really the cold. It was moisture. The breath of your own sleeping family, rising all night, condensing on the inside of a freezing cover and dripping back down into the robes and the bedding. Damp hide stops holding heat. And so people died wrapped up in the warmest place they owned, killed by the simple fact that they were breathing. The answer to that is the quietest object in the whole structure. Inside, a second wall was hung around the poles, running only part way up. A liner, a dew cloth. And that narrow gap it creates changes everything. Cold air seeping in at the base no longer crawls across the floor and over sleeping bodies. It is caught in the channel and pulled upward, warming as it climbs, feeding the very draft that carries the smoke away. Water, running down the inside of the cover, follows that same channel down to the ground instead of falling into the beds. One thin strip of hide, standing between a family and a silent death. And here is the strangest part of all. Every piece of this system, the tuned cover, the tilted frame, the hidden wall, was designed to be taken apart and erased from the earth by morning. Why would anyone build that way on purpose? At the center of it all sat the fire, and the fire was never trying to make summer. It was after something harder than warmth. Stability. Keep the drafts off the body, keep the bedding dry, hold one zone where people could rest and mend and recover. The door faced east toward the morning light, the hearth held the middle, and the places where people slept and sat were arranged around the wall by custom and by kinship, which means the social life of the lodge and its thermal performance were never two separate things. They were the same design. And then, when the season turned, the whole house came down. It is tempting to call that a compromise, as though a people who had to move settled for a weaker home. That gets it exactly backward. Mobility was not the price of the Tipi. Mobility was its power. The poles that held the roof became the travois that dragged the load. The cover rolled into a bundle. Every single part had to earn the weight it cost you. So why build a house designed to disappear? Not out of poverty, out of a choice. A permanent house asks you to pile your worth in one place and then spend the rest of your life defending it. These were people who measured wealth by what they could carry, not by what they left behind, and who never assumed the land owed them a foundation. Which is why the teepee does not prove that Plains peoples were surprisingly advanced. That phrase was always condescending. It proves that the yardstick most of us inherited for measuring intelligence, the one that only counts stone and steel and things written down, was too narrow from the very beginning. So, one last time, what kind of house survives a 100-mile-an-hour gale, holds a family at 40 below, and vanishes before sunrise without leaving a scar? Not a tent. Never a tent. Its genius was never that it stood. Its genius was that it stood lightly. Comfort without permanence. Strength without mass. Safety that never turned a home into a prison of material and fuel. And it leaves us with a question we still have not answered. How much energy does shelter actually need? How do you live in a place without consuming it? The Plains gave one answer, and it was not concrete, and it was not steel. It was poles, hide, airflow, and fire. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to Dark Origins, because the deeper you look into the past, the harder it gets to keep calling it primitive.